Oh, hello, world. It's me, your old pal Dan Shaheen. Welcome to Comic Book News. A little bit early today. Started a few minutes early because our guest has a hard out, like at the top of the hour. And man, I got a lot to talk about this guy because, oh man, he's such an important figure in the world of comics. Today, we're going to talk to who? Paul Levitz. We'll have him here. We'll have him here in the Batcave pretty soon. And oh yeah, over here. And we'll chat him up about his 47-year career at DC Comics. Started as an assistant editor, walked out of there president of the joint. Pretty cool story, and presided over some of the greatest comics of our era. I really think brought a love of the medium and a love of comics, as well as the broader world of fiction and science fiction, into DC Comics, and producing just some of the greatest works that we've seen, the first works that kind of like will last and have echoed through the ages, and I hope will continue to. Before we talk to Paul, though, a couple seconds for show business. Hey, if you haven't already, consider clicking subscribe on this thing. There's a little button down there that says subscribe. Click on that thing. Click on the little bell. You'll even get notifications every time I do a new live stream like this. A lot of you do that, statistically speaking, according to my analytics. And I love that. So please consider doing that. Another thing I want you to consider is I want you to consider sending your comics here, where? To the $1 Million Mailbox, P.O. Box 1163, Arcata, California, 95518. You can send them here. I'll spread them out on the $1 Million Comics Cam. I'll take a look at them. I'll give you my honest opinion about them, along with my pal Larry Young from AIT Planet Lair. So now, without any further ado, since we're a little pressed for time, I want to welcome here to Comic Book News for the very first time, Mr. Paul Levitz. Paul, welcome to Comic Book News.
Hey, Dan. Pleasure.
Great. I know you're a busy guy, and I appreciate you taking the time to be here.
I try to keep entertained.
Well, I got a list of places, man, from your website, which is excellent, by the way. I recommend everybody check out paullevitz.com. Just doing that will save me a lot of time answering questions about your backstory. But man, you've appeared on NPR's On Point, the keynote at the Frankfurt Book Fair, Comic-Con International. You've spoken at Google, MIT, and now finally Comic Book News with Dan Shaheen. So how does that feel?
No, I guess I'm getting up in the world, Dan.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Man, but you have such a long career in comics. Can you just tell us where it began, and we'll give a kind of cliff notes of the career?
So in the early 1970s, pretty much the whole American comic book industry was centered around New York City. And I had the good fortune to be born in the city, in Brooklyn, many of the great creators of comics, and started out doing one of the early fanzines with a buddy of mine, Paul Kupperberg, when we were kids, sort of a TV guide attempt for the comic business in the days when publishers weren't telling you when the next issue was coming out or who was going to be doing the next issue. And that got me to know the vast majority of the people working in the field at the time. Fast forward of doing that for about 3 years, and I'm walking through the halls of DC, and Joe Orlando ushers me into his office and asks if I'd like to write his letter columns. I'm not a writer, Joe. You write well enough to write a letter column. We'll acknowledge from a much more gray-haired point of view that that's not a very high bar. But I was happy to have the assignment. All of a sudden, I was a professional writer at 16 years old.
Did you ever make up letters? I always wondered about that.
Mystery books you had to all the time.
Oh, you did?
Superhero books, you usually had enough interesting letters to work with. But the mystery comics went, I assume, to both a younger audience and certainly a less fan-oriented audience. So you'd get a couple of letters from the more serious comic fans or somebody commenting on the art, perhaps. But if there was blank space, you had to do something. So sometimes I'd invite my friends who were over at the house to contribute. Sometimes we'd all sit there making them up together. But you filled the space one way or another.
Okay, cool.
You tried to do it honestly. in terms of what a reader might like or dislike in it. And
you try to do it honestly, and then when you can't, you lie. That's works.
You try to represent what you think the readers might say.
Sure.
In the course of that, rather than just, oh God, I loved every page that was published in this book since the beginning of time. Well, for that you would probably have needed a serious lobotomy. So let's take a more balanced view of what the material is.
Did you really like getting like seriously negative letters? Because sometimes they would print them, I remember, in the comics. Just
sure, it gave you something to talk back to and to have a correspondence with. And sometimes as an editor, you agreed with it. That's perhaps this is secrets behind the comics, but the people who put the books together don't necessarily love every piece of work that they publish. There's days when, for one reason or another, the creative people working on a project don't do their best work, or circumstances made it impossible, or some rule the company has in place made it more difficult. And you look at what you did that day and you said, well, I did the best I could considering, and something has to be published. But there are days when hopefully you're really proud of the work that you do. There's other days when you say, I did an honest day's work. I did the best I could. And there's other days where it's sort of, it would be nice if nobody ever looks at this again. And I think
you must have done a good job at faking those letters and responding to the real ones, because it wasn't long before you were given like a full editorship of Batman. Is that right? Is that how the progression went?
You're condensing a few years there. I mean, Joe's assistant went on vacation that summer. He offered me the chance to fill in. 16 years old and on staff at DC Comics. This is a pretty good deal. His assistant, a guy named Michael Fleischer, didn't come back. Michael went on to write a lot of good comics, Jonah Hex, some stuff from Marvel as well. I think Conan over there. Went on to get a PhD and do a lot of interesting work for the UN in Africa. Led quite a fascinating life. And I never left. So I did about 3 years as an assistant editor, and then then I became a full editor shortly after Jeanette Kahn arrived at DC and began to shake things up. And a couple of years into being a full editor, I was given the Batman books to work on, which was the peak of my editorial career, certainly.
So, and you replaced Julie Schwartz as editor? That's what Wikipedia told me anyway.
Yeah, you shouldn't trust Wikipedia too much. I mean, Julie had been doing a couple of the Batman books. Other people were doing the others. It was a moment where we were shuffling all the titles, and Julie, as the senior guy in the house by far, got his choice of, Julie, we want to have all of Superman and all of Batman, each with a specific editor for stylistic continuity. Which would you like to do? And Julie preferred doing Superman, which is a decision I would have argued with if I were his buddy in the room, because I think Julie enjoyed doing Batman more, but he felt Superman was the more prestigious. And he got to have his pick, as he should have, after the number of years and contributions he made.
And this was post 66, obviously, Batman. So the shine had faded from the TV show, and the comics went from, sort of that cornier iteration into something a little more darker, a little more gritty. Was that?
Yeah.
Because of your tenure, or did that start before your tenure?
No, that's really Julie working with Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams that turns the corner on that. We added a lot of stuff to the mythology that even survives to some extent today. In the time I was editing it, those were the first issues that developed a real romance between Batman and Catwoman, for example, which I know they use all over the place these days.
Yeah, they're married now, I think.
Yeah, I can't keep track. I read enough of them in my time. The parole board met. It said you're free now. I'm not following this month's issues with that kind of energy.
I was surprised to read that you even read Marvel comics all the way up until 1989. Like, were you a completist as far as like reading everything coming out?
I don't know if I managed to read everything, but I have the first 30 years of Marvel bound on my shelves as well.
That's amazing.
I read all what I viewed as the good stuff. At some point or another, I remember Captain America went through an extraordinarily long dry streak where it was just, why am I putting these books on the shelf? It hasn't been good for however many years. But eventually it turns around and somebody else interesting takes it on and does something fun with it.
So you mentioned the late great Denny O'Neil too. I'm sorry, I'm going to sort of like take you along your career path and talk about some of these people.
Sure.
Can you think of anything he would Denny would rather be called than social justice warrior? I mean, don't you think that is the epitome? Like, he really fought for it at such an early stage to make a representation in the comics.
I think that Denny would like to be remembered as a writer. When you're a writer, aspects of your philosophy of life, whether it's political, social, moral, religious, go into your work. Denny was a deeply thoughtful man on many, many levels. There was a period late in his life when he was even working with a group that was investigating whether the world needed a new religion that would balance out people's behavior towards the world in a better way. And he was very proud of his career as a writer. He was proud of his career as an editor and particularly the people that he trained. He was an extraordinary editor at developing his assistants into solid creative people. Did he do a lot of stories that related to an element of what we today call social justice? Yeah, that's certainly a fair characterization of a body of the work. But it was first and foremost about entertaining the readers.
Sure.
And telling stories.
But I mean, when people say, yeah, they used to tell stories about these themes were covered in comics, but they didn't put them in your face. I feel like they did put them in your face back then in a way that was like that needed to be done.
If you read any writer's body of work from any period of time, going back, not just comics, prose, science fiction you talked about before, who we are as writers comes through in our work. You are who you are. Some people are blunter about it. In DC's world, I remember giving Jack Schiff, one of the early Golden Age editors. He was on staff at DC from the early 1940s to the late 1960s. And in the library, the thing Jack pulled out that he was most proud of was those public service pages that used to run in DC in the 1950s and early 1960s that were things like pitches for brotherhood and what we would now call social justice. Everybody has a point of view in life, and it's not, some of it is about politics, but most of it is about what you want the world to be. And that's not necessarily a function of what political party you subscribe to or what body of social justice war you stand for, but this is what I hope will be, and it comes through in your work in some fashion or another. Sometimes more bluntly, sometimes more subtly.
True. So, and no doubt that for every arguably ham-fisted message or whatever, the amount that was added to Batman, sort of as a more noir-ish character, trying to sort of react away from the 66 TV show that loomed large in people's mind. I felt like there was a reaction to it in a very good way, and led to so much of the stuff we've seen on Batman since that dominates the idea of Batman to this day. How instrumental is Denny O'Neil and let's say Marshall Rogers and maybe a few others in that way?
Well, I mean, I think Denny wins the battle of influences on Batman because of the length of his tenure as well as his skill. He's a significant part of the story of Batman from 1970 when he writes his first Batman stories to, I don't know, maybe 95 or 2000 when he gets up from the desk as Batman's group editor. I don't remember what year it was anymore. It all kind of blurs together in my head. And beyond that, people he trained continuing to contribute to Batman in the process. So, just by sheer numbers, his view probably is more significant than anybody else's. Marshall did some wonderful stories with Steve in the late 70s.
Yeah, Marshall Rogers.
70s. But he only did a handful of stories. And, so many people have been a part of Batman. And there are a few guys who did only a few stories that mattered an enormous amount. Frank certainly is in that category. But for the most part, you might remember and love the stories that Steve and Marshall did, and they were important for the development of the character, but they don't carry the same weight as Denny having touched hundreds, literally, if not 1,000 Batman stories along the way.
So tell me, you mentioned Frank Miller here. By that stage, so you went on to become an editor. You were an editor for was Jeanette Kahn the publisher at that?
Yep.
That time? That's by the way, a dream interview. One of the people I would really love to talk to. I haven't been able to reach out to her.
Yeah, I wouldn't bet on her doing a podcast.
Yeah, that's what it seems like. But however, during that time, it was just such a fertile time for comics. When did you become publisher? What year were you?
Well, we started using the publisher title for me in '89, but basically I was doing very much the same job from '81 onward.
Okay.
In modern business terms, I was essentially, once Jeanette became the chief executive of the company, I became the chief operating officer. Gotcha. The guy responsible for the nuts and bolts of getting stuff done on a daily basis.
Okay, so you were around for that Michael Golden Batman special, 1982.
Yeah, I don't think I had much to do with it, but
yeah, but it from that era on, because it was just such a pre-Miller though, and up until Miller, it's just kind of an underrated period of development for Batman. I think people like Frank Miller didn't write that many Batman stories, right? Like he did a few that were obviously super important, but
right,
pre-Miller, where quite a bit was getting shaken up about what like.
Again, remember, I guess from the distance you're at, it all looks like these are all individual figures. But in the late, it was about a 5-year period in the late 70s when I hosted a weekly poker game. And it was Denny, it was Mike Barr, who I think may have written that Mike Golden.
He did.
One that you're talking about. Marty Pasco, Roger Slifer, Steve Mitchell, Jack Abel, Al Milgram, Jim Shooter, Tom DeFalco, Roger McKenzie, Dickie McKenzie. Once in a while, Frank might have popped in, particularly in the period when he and Roger were working closely together and were both out in Long Island City when the game rotated out there once or twice. Chris Claremont would drop in. This was a social community, and we were all, Len Wein, Marv Wolfman, we were all influencing each other in the process. And the idea, it doesn't take anything away from anybody's personal contribution in the stories they did, but the tides were moving in certain directions. And a lot of it was moving towards more creative expression within the superhero material. As the marketplace moved from the newsstand to the comic shop, in essence, we were going to a new form of the comic book. The comic book that existed in the newsstand universe was an impulse purchase for young kids, very casual, not based on your knowledge of the product, not based on who the writer or the artist credit was, but was there a gorilla on the cover that month? Was there a great line of copy that Stan wrote that served as a fabulous invitation in? To a very knowing, nice gorilla, to a very knowing market, older people who knew who the writers and artists were and had very specific tastes. and were going to often great lengths to get their comics. So pretty much everything about the form changes. There's a marketing concept called product life cycle. And you can basically argue that the products are, although they're physically the same and that there was a continuity of publication, that ultimately these are two different products because they have different marketing characteristics. The comic that existed in the newsstand world and the comic that existed in the comic shop world. And then, of course, we've moved into yet another stage with the era of the graphic novel.
Right. Well, which brings us, we got people out there watching live. Please bring up Alan Moore. So the era of the graphic novel. I mean, it's said before Watchmen, there were no perennial graphic novels that stayed in print forever. And one of Alan Moore's major gripes was that he signed a deal assuming the rights, that it would go out of print and the rights would revert to him. And since that never happened, he felt slighted, along with a laundry list of other things and many, many people and organizations that wronged him in whatever way. That seemed to be like the beginning of sort of the fallout. Am I right about that?
Alan had a bunch of issues over the years with pretty much every publisher he ever worked with, including us. The idea of an in-print clause was relatively new to comics in the era of Watchmen, but it was a new good thing for the talent, because prior to that, pretty much all the deals were, you're going to work for us, we're going to own and control everything you do forever. Doesn't matter what happens to it. And Watchmen was one of the first batch of things that had in it what had been a tradition of the book publishing industry, an industry that you can generally find any academic or any legal scholar or working agent will tell you historically has been considerably more pro writer, pro talent than the comic book industry. Again, not a very high standard to beat.
I don't know how you could be worse.
You could. There are industries that are worse.
Sure.
Certainly today, after we've fixed an awful lot of the worst of the comic book business.
What would be your example of one that's worse, like commercial art or what? I mean,
commercial art, advertising, even animation.
Yeah.
You know, if you create a wonderful new animated character today, most of the deals still today are great. You've got a great idea. We'll hire you to execute it. And when we're finished with you, you're done and you won't see another dime. There are exceptions to that. There are places where people do have equity in their properties, which is great. But
I'm glad you brought that up. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but the idea of royalties and creators getting their due, especially in this age of mega multi-million billion-dollar adaptations of comics from the 60s, 70s, and on. A lot of guys like Jim Starlin felt like Marvel didn't live up to their end of the deal when it comes to royalties and their characters. How do you, what are your feelings on that subject?
I'm very proud of what I was a part of at DC, where we instituted the first standard royalty plan for creative talent in comics. Marvel followed about a month later because they had to, but we managed to create the change. Jeanette, even before I was active in it, started the first modern plan for giving creative people financial equity in their characters when their characters were adapted into movies or TV shows or had toys made out of them.
Pretty revolutionary idea at that moment, was it not?
It depends on how you think of revolutionary. If you think of
revolutionary, is the better.
You know, if you want to make an argument that democracy is still a revolutionary idea because the majority of the people on Earth don't live in democracies where they get to vote for their laws and their leaders, yes, democracy is still a revolutionary idea in a lot of places.
I think direct democracy is a humongously contentious issue, even.
Absolutely. Maybe you can go to a New England town and still have a town hall vote. but there's not a lot of that going on. But even indirect democracy, still does not exist for many millions of people. Well, royalties existed for a long time. They go back in many ways to the stationers' company agreements that helped create the first copyright acts in England in the 18th century, if my memory's working. My memory doesn't always work. I apologize to the viewers if I'm citing it wrong. When I teach it in class, I have the notes open so I can look in them and be accurate.
They'll forgive you.
But the memory is not what it used to be. But royalties have been around for centuries.
Sure, yeah, no, absolutely. Even the pulp writers, right?
Most of the pulp writers did not receive royalties.
No,
that was mostly done on a per word basis. But traditional prose writers did, in most cases, with published books.
In the pulp area, and they lost the copyright and everything. They were just writing that stuff, ripping and running, huh? Yeah.
It was work for hire. Often, a lot of them were writing a novel a week. It was an outrageously productive period for guys like Walter Gibson and Lester Dent, who were filling those pages. But going back to where we were, royalties was not a brilliant new concept.
Sure.
Participation in things that you created was not a brilliant new concept. It doesn't exist in all fields. It doesn't exist in science. If you go to work for a drug company and you come up with the key development that makes a new vaccine to deal with the plague that we've got going on, you get a pat on the head. You may get your name on the patent. You probably will be treated very nicely by the company, and you may get a very nice bonus and a very comfortable laboratory to work in for the rest of your life, doing whatever amuses you. And that's the deal. But you don't get a dime for every shot that goes into people's arms.
The guy who invented the chicken McNugget, he didn't make money off it, right? It was Ronald got all that cash.
We can argue when it's more fair and when it's less fair, but both Jeanette and I believed fervently and worked very hard for many years on the concept that if you align the interests of people so that when the company wins, they win as individuals, you'll get better work, you'll get more committed work, you'll get people taking more chances, and you'll get people bringing you more interesting work than they might bring to a competitor that doesn't treat people as well.
Okay, so in that same era, you presided over the classic crisis era of DC Comics, and for good or for ill, right? I mean, I feel like they've taken that concept and they've just tried to milk it for decades since then. But so for me, I was a kid that didn't read DC Comics. I was a Marvel zombie until the Crisis, and it gave me a chance to get Flash #1 and Man of Steel particularly. I thought that John Byrne's work on Man of Steel was one and only Superman complete revamps that ever really stuck in the world.
Back in the day, there weren't a lot of Superman revamps, so up to that point, there wasn't a lot of competition for that. Since then, I guess
that's true, but there have been since then, and none of them, in my humble opinion, like became canon for as long and considered canonical, yet were so revolutionary as what Byrne did. How do you feel about that?
It certainly worked commercially. I enjoyed a lot of the work. I thought John was a good voice. One of the most interesting assignments I had in the course of my career was to boil down the list of things that could be changed or couldn't be changed in Superman, because we had, besides John, 3 or 4 other teams of people who were competing to be the person to revamp Superman. And I was given that project to do as someone who knew the characters deeply. And I wish I had saved that document, but I didn't.
Can you tell us who was competing for that in those pitches?
Oh, well, Carrie and Elliott, who had been writing a lot of Superman for a long time. I think Steve Gerber was pitching at that point. I think there were 2 or 3 others. As I said, my memory is not what it used to be.
Yeah. And was it just John Byrne's commercial clout that made him the guy?
Yeah, I don't think it was as much John's commercial clout, though that certainly was a positive factor. But it was the creative point of view he was bringing to what he wanted to do with the character.
Yeah. I thought it was fresh and great. And while not everything stuck over the years, it's just in my mind for the time when it was coming out, holds a special place in my heart. Also, though, interestingly enough, I mean, you came in, I'm assuming you were there. I'm trying to figure out timeline wise when both Kirby and Ditko did their works, came from Marvel to DC. That had to be a little bit right in there in your early days, right?
I got to do about 20 stories with Steve. He was the artist on the series Stalker that we created together. Wally Wood was the inker. That was insane good luck for a 17, 18-year-old kid to get to work with 2 icons of the field in that fashion. Jack I've worked with a little bit. He drew 2 stories that I broke down for editors over the years, but never anything that I fully wrote myself, unfortunately. But, you know, we were friendly for years. He did the cover for the last issue of my fanzine. We certainly overlapped a fair amount. So
it was, you know, after his problems with creator rights and such, do you think he got a way better deal out of DC than he did at Marvel? I think that kind of goes without saying.
Oh, mercifully, it doesn't go without his having said it. I mean, I was very, very pleased that Jack, in his later years, would cheerfully talk about the fact that he'd made more from Darkseid than he made from the whole cast of the Marvel characters.
That's great. That's great.
The litigation that his family went through after his passing in more recent years obviously has flipped that over, which is wonderful. I'm glad his kids and grandkids have more money to play with as they deserve. And
was that Darkseid money from what, like the Kenner deals and the Super Friends stuff?
Yeah, the Kenner toys, the cartoons, any place that we were licensing the character out in those years.
Yeah, that's great. That's really great that he could get it in that way.
I enjoyed negotiating those contracts.
Okay, so you also mentioned, and I was really surprised to hear, kind of, that your inspiration for getting into comics, in a way, was this guy. Ooh, scary! This is a scary picture of Jim Shooter. But you know, he was like a child wunderkind writing Legion of Superheroes, right? And was sort of, in many ways, inspiration for you to think that you could get a job in comics.
Well, I mean, I still remember being on my stoop in Brooklyn and reading an Adventure Comics letter column that talked about 13-year-old Jim writing the story. And I was 9. I'm actually 5 years younger than Jim, but the time it took to get stuff published, I guess, threw the chronology out. But at 9, I could imagine, well, I'll be 13 someday. I don't think I could have imagined being the age that most of the writers who were working in comics were. But I was a great fan of his work. He's a wonderfully talented writer and editor. We took each other's money at cards for years.
Okay, great. So you guys were personal friends and like direct competitors, right? At that moment in that 80s time, right? You were the Bizarro hero. Jim was the Bizarro you, right?
You know, our lives have intertwined a little bit out of the Legion work that we've both done over the years, and the fact that we both had important desk jobs at the main houses at different points, but very different career paths, very different priorities in life in many different ways.
And definitely different reputations, different career trajectory, right? Because let's keep going on the Levitz train. Let's keep going on the Levitz career train, because this stuff coming out in the 80s. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Paul.
I'm just not as tall as Jim. I don't have as many muscles. You know,
You just keep contact with him to this day?
yeah, first I saw him a couple of years ago, right before the lockdown started, at a birthday party for Steve Jeppy. I mean, we haven't played poker in a lot of years, but every now and then, when there's an occasion that requires it.
He's on my dream interview list too, so I'm trying to get. I think he's gettable, but I haven't been able to make the connection yet. Okay, so that was a time period in the 80s. I mean, the strongest new voices in comics, people that would revolutionize not just the characters, but in many ways, the idea of what comics were. We were taking stuff and putting out comics aimed at an adult audience, as well as collecting into bookstores, and mark this sort of shift, the beginning of that shift of power, I think, from the direct market into the wider world of the book trade.
I'm not sure it's a function that the power went to the book trade. I think that we were able to produce a physical package that a wider range of people were comfortable with. There are problems with the comic shop experience. Many of them are not in great geographic locations within their towns. So even if you told people there's this great new thing happening in comics, go check it out. Well, where do I go buy it? Okay, you got to do your homework to figure that out.
Dirty Joe's Comic Shop down on 95th Street.
A lot of them were pleasant stores in one fashion or another, and a lot of them were very good retailers, but for the most part, they weren't in the prime real estate, because their prime customers were people who would deliberately go there, and it was a shopping experience. It was your sports bar. I want to go down on Wednesday and talk to other people who care about the same things I do.
I think those that tried to be in prime locations didn't survive. It doesn't work in prime location. It wasn't there then, and I still don't think it's there unless you're hawking primarily T-shirts and tchotchkes, which is definitely an option.
The dollars per square foot are tough to achieve. There are stores that cross over and do it. Over the years, I've seen like Newberry Comics, which is large, as your point, is largely not a comic shop per se. But they have a wide selection of graphic novels. They have a wide selection of comics. They got a lot of other stuff, including the world of music. And the mix that they've found enables them to be in high-end malls and environments these days, which is great. But everybody's found their own solution for managing it as a business. By putting the other problem with the comics as individual periodicals was you really had to be committed and coming week after week to get your story. And it might be sold out by Friday. The graphic novel form, packaging it as a book, was a familiar form. People understood it. You were getting the whole story when you bought it. It was great to buy in a comic shop, but it was also available in other places where people who like to read could go and get their reading material. So it broadened the audience. And as we were doing a wider range of creative material in the field over the next batch of years, from the late 80s through the 90s into the new century, that form becomes dominant because there's more flavors of ice cream being offered. And that's great. And that's, it amazes me to see the range of stuff that we're doing these days.
So that was at a time. So Warner owned DC Comics during that entire tenure.
It's sort of, we've been part of the same company as Warner Brothers in some fashion or another since my childhood.
Right. But since then, it's been purchased by AT&T, and there's been a lot of mergers, a lot of changes, and a lot of getting away from a company where Warner Brothers its core competency was entertainment. Now we're into its core competency is telecommunications. It feels like they're even one step removed from the creative content. And we've seen a massive contraction of the comics being put out by DC Comics just in the past year or two. It seems like Batman is the only thing that they really are all in on. And even secondary, it used to be tertiary characters were getting the axe, but it's like nobody but Batman or somebody connected to Batman has a book at DC right now.
I don't know if it's quite as bad as you're picturing it, but there's certainly an awful lot more Batman than there has been since the 1966 craziness. I mean, remember there was a time there where Batman was guest starring with Jerry Lewis even?
Ooh, those are great ones.
So, you know, they haven't gotten any stupider than the company has been at one time or another in its past in that regard.
Goody Rickles crossover, anyone?
Yeah. I mean, there's by AT&T's own, I think, admission, there was a cultural disconnect between the culture of a tech wiring company and the culture of a creative chaos company. Not specifically DC, but all of what they called Warner Media, the way they grouped it together. Warner Brothers, Turner, HBO. And they're moving it now. They're realigning it so that the Warner Media assets will go over probably in another month or so to being part of Discovery, which is a company that is more content aligned.
Yes.
And perhaps that will be a better home. We'll see as time goes on.
Let's hope so. I really feel like, you know, it's well worn territory that we know comics are the R&D lab for Hollywood, right? Like that's so that they're worth something beyond just owning the IP and licensing them to other publishers to create comics. There's a certain value in creating them in-house, or is there? This is where I'm going, because like could DC function just as easily, not just as easily, but just as successfully or more successfully by simply licensing their characters out for other publishers to take the risks on?
I don't think so, but you know, that's a view I've held for decades. Yeah. in the discussions that came up from time to time.
It was considered.
The reason for that, if you license the characters out, the licensee doesn't have incentive to take short-term costs for long-term benefits because they're not owning the character. You know, the long-term benefits that came from, let's go back to Frank's Dark Knight Returns, the long-term benefits of that to the Batman property, whether its influence on the movies that followed or its influence on how the character changed and developed, the long-term benefit of the constant sale of the original work in its many different forms it's been published in. If you licensed it out, the licensee isn't going to be around to get those benefits. You look at a license like Star Trek.
They're not going to get the benefit. I see what you're saying.
You know, you look at Star Trek, which has been published by Western, DC twice, I think, Marvel,
IDW currently, I believe.
IDW, somebody else along the way. I've lost track.
Yeah. Gold Key already, yeah.
Maybe 6 or 7 different publishers. None of those ever invested in doing new Star Trek material that would improve the franchise, both because they weren't going to get the benefit out of it, so it wasn't worth the investment on that level, and licensor structures of quality control and management don't encourage that behavior to exist.
Oh man, I think John Byrne's getting mad. He's giving you the side eye right now because he did all that Star Trek stuff.
I think John's still doing some Star Trek stuff and all by himself that he publishes on his website or something.
Well, yeah, speaking of John and publishing stuff on his website, I have to hear what you think of X-Men Elsewhen, or if you know anything about that.
You know, I haven't followed it, but you know, it's making him happy. Why not?
It's making a lot of people happy.
If Marvel doesn't mind, then God bless them. They're having fun.
I don't think it's a question of whether they mind. It's they can't really do anything about it. He's not breaking any laws because he's not selling it.
I'm not going to get into that discussion.
And he's not using logos and what have you. He's just like drawing pictures. How can you? It's a First Amendment thing almost.
No, it's not.
Why not? And are they not, by not going after them, are they setting a precedent? Are they allowing their stuff to go into the public domain somehow, or to?
So,
because I don't see that they would take that chance.
This is a several-hour discussion. You're dealing with several sets of laws.
Yes.
Copyright law does not require you to pursue every infringer. You can decide, I'm going to squash this bug and I'm going to ignore this bug, whether it's making money or not. You can say, I'm going to let all bugs that have a beard survive, and I'm going to squash all bugs that have mustaches.
I hope not.
Trademark law does require you to squash all bugs that use trademarks.
And he's stayed away from trademark infringement in his work.
I haven't looked at John's work, but he's a smart guy. I would assume that he's doing it in a rational fashion.
Yeah.
So he may be able to find a line in the process that doesn't trigger anything that gives Marvel the urge to make his life difficult.
Okay, fair enough.
He's happy and they're happy. God bless them.
I think it's great. I honestly, though, feel like I have a hard time figuring out, like, what's the line that he's crossing. I feel like he's walked right up to the line, and by not, it's almost like those guys that you're at a convention, an artist can draw Batman all day long and sell the original, but can't sell prints of that, for instance.
You know, again, we could spend hours talking about the intellectual property laws of this country, which of them work, which of them are frayed at the very least.
I'd love to have that conversation with you sometime, maybe with Michael Finn, the renowned superhero copyright lawyer, friend of the show, who's been on here before with Mark Wade, to talk about their exploration of the public domain characters.
Yeah, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that without the media.
Oh, you don't find that kind of legal analysis fascinating? All right, let's dive back into comics before we lose any.
I'm really happy having that kind of legal discussion with, let's say, my buddy who teaches IP at Harvard.
Yes,
and has a bigger comic collection than I do, but I don't have any interest in doing that for the public amusement.
I got you. That's where I think, though, a conversation with someone like Michael Finn, like I'm suggesting, would be it would be a very fascinating conversation people would love to hear.
Not without the meter running.
Okay, let's talk about Paul Levitz, the author. That's why I was sort of going in this book trade direction a minute ago, right? We're in a day where they just announced an all-new, original Fantastic Four, fully painted graphic novel by Alex Ross.
Cool.
And it's not coming out from Marvel, right? It's coming out from Abrams Comic Arts.
It's still coming out from Marvel. It's being published by Abrams because Charlie Kochman, who's the editorial director of Abrams Comic Arts, has a long-standing relationship with Alex, going back to Alex's tabloid-sized books that he did for us at DC, where I have no inside information, but historically speaking, the two of these guys have a good working relationship. Alex has no reason at this point in his career to do anything where the circumstances aren't exactly what he wants. And I can imagine a conversation that goes, yeah, I'll be happy to do that project if you can get Charlie there.
Sorry, Comic Tropes. I was going to ask your question. I'm sorry if I'm making you uncomfortable with any of this line of questioning, Paul. I don't think I was.
It'll work a lot harder to make me uncomfortable.
Thank you. Well, Comic Tropes does have an actually decent comment here to say. Thoughts on the Filipino wave in the 70s? DC brought in a lot of popular, talented artists. Were the artists happy with how they were treated? Many stayed loyal to DC, but not everyone.
You know, it was one of the bizarrest moments of effective capitalism. At the time that the Filipino artists began working for DC and largely working for Marvel under the same conditions, the local wages in the Philippines for a top comic artist were about $4 to $5 a page. The local wages in the US for a top comic artist were $50, $60 a page, maybe a little bit more.
Yeah.
So the deal was struck originally with Tony DeZuniga, who was the first sort of studio manager who brought those guys' art over, later Nestor Redondo. Originally, I think it was at $17 a page. The guys in the Philippines thought they were ripping off the gringos ridiculously. We're getting 3 times what we get paid here. We can afford maids. We can afford to buy a new house. We can afford whatever we want. We'll be able to do that. We'll do this for 2 years, and we'll be able to afford to move to the US if we want to. And the American publishers thought, we're ripping off these idiots ridiculously because we're paying them a third of what we'd have, or a quarter of what we'd have to pay our guys. So everybody, in that sense, everybody was having a marvelous time.
That's what, yeah, it sounds like a good relationship when everybody thinks the other guy's unhappy or whatever.
You know, again, from a, if you will, social justice standpoint, you know, it's an example of outsourcing. And you can make arguments all ways in these things. Is it a lovely thing to have something manufactured in China where the working people are making a quarter of what an American worker, or a tenth of what an American worker might get paid for an hour, but they're making more money than their families have ever seen before, and they're coming out of poverty in the process?
This goes on to this day with things like Fiverr and the gig economy, and you know, you can hire people from all over the world to do all kinds of crazy stuff.
And it's very complicated, morally as well as philosophically. There's an enormous amount that I don't like about the systems politically in China, but I've had the pleasure for the last decade of teaching a lot of students from China. One of the programs I teach in had a strong affiliation with a couple of the universities over there in Wuhan and in Beijing, and I've been over there for that. I have enormous admiration for the fact that they pulled something like 300 million people out of poverty in time. Well, a lot of what goes on there sucks. The one-child policy, when that was in operation, sort of one of the simplest to explain awful things.
Yeah, that's pretty easy to boil down.
You know, can we abort more little girl children in utero so that we only get boys?
Right.
Oh, well, guys, I'm telling you. But in some ways, the world has gotten more reliant on each other, and it's bringing up the standards of living in more places.
Yeah, it's complex. It's because, yeah, we want to protect American interests and American business and all that, but we also want to uplift the world. And in some ways, that's going to cause a flattening and a leveling, whether we like it or not. It's already happening.
Yeah, if my kids had a slightly harder time getting a start in life because a kid in China was able to put their food in a refrigerator, you know, I can't feel too horrible about that.
It's tough. I'll give you that, Paul.
Again, this goes to your personal philosophy. You know, your mileage may differ, but it's a complex world out there. Overall, I think a really high percentage of the guys who were working for us in the Philippines in that first tranche of people ended up with better lives as a result. Many of them moved to America, ended up working in the animation industry. Some of them worked in the comics industry at American rates for any number of years. Guys like Alfredo Alcala did a ton of work for Marvel. Ernie Chan, who did a lot of work for DC, then a lot of work for Marvel.
Yeah.
Ernie's
one of those guys who I stumbled on his work more recently. I think in the Incredible Hulk, he did some stuff, I think, and I was just blown away that I hadn't seen more of him. That's definitely a guy I want to look into.
Hardworking man,
an amazing artist who his influences weren't as readily apparent as some. I think I really liked the way his stuff looked. Okay, so you went you saw it all from that era into the 80s into the dark, and we're running out of time quickly, so I have to move us forward in time a little bit more, because you got through, oh my lord, the Heroes World implosion. Back to the business of comics for a second. Marvel really made a big mistake in hindsight, right? It's obvious that they made a mistake thinking.
It wasn't a mistake in hindsight. It was a mistake in foresight, hindsight.
Just plain old sight. It was a big mistake. It was a big glaring, like, do not enter sign. And they went through it like Leroy Jenkins.
When Terry called to tell me they were doing that as a courtesy, I said, I may forgive you, but I guarantee you my wife is not going to forgive you for the next few months of my life.
Okay, so that went down. DC pulled the switch. I'm guessing you were instrumental in that decision to go. You could have bought Diamond distributors if you wanted to. Is that right? Yeah, you could have. I know, because Steve Jeppy told me a couple times. You guys could have done it. You didn't do it. And I think you made the exact correct decision for DC and the industry at that time. Okay. In hindsight, I think
it worked. I will, whether there was a better decision to be made, I'll defer to, some academic or genius who can analyze it. I had access, obviously, to more information than basically any person who's written about this in the ensuing 25 years.
Yeah.
I'm still comfortable that we made the best move that was available to us at the time.
Okay. I agree. I know Steve Jeppy agrees with that for sure. I don't know how Milton Green feels about it, but I know how Steve Jeppy feels about it.
I think Milton understood.
Yeah. No, he did. Actually, I have talked to him too. I've interviewed him too. This subject is really important to me, because now we have this lesson, and we had a leader in Paul Levitz who saw that thing happening, made that decision. How did that decision, did it get erased from the corporate memory of DC Comics? Because during this pandemic, DC Comics made a move to break that relationship.
Oh, look,
and that really started a chain of dominoes that has not finished falling as we speak, as far as both DC and Marvel pulling out of Diamond as their exclusive distributor.
That decision, and a lot of the things that we accomplished with that were not necessarily immediately obvious to everyone, was very specific to the moment of time. And I'm not running DC. I'm not running any comic book company for the last 11 years, whatever it is now, 12 years. Jesus, time flies when you're having fun. I don't have access to the same level of information. I'm going to assume that the people running DC and running Marvel are using the information they have and are trying to make the best decision they know how. It's their turn. They're not stupid people. Did I accomplish something better than they're accomplishing now? Time will tell. But even then, you can't compare one to the other. It's one thing.
It's a totally different set of circumstances that led to it, but you can really draw a line between that point, the Heroes World DC exclusivity, and that moment, the pandemic, where they pulled out of that due to a clause probably put in originally when you either contract had lapsed or there was a clause that would allow DC to.
The contract had expired and had been renewed, and along the way, contracts usually are not written in perpetuity. But
from what I understand from pretty inside sources, there was an offer made, a counter offer from Diamond, and then nothing, then radio silence and like a press release.
Beats me. I don't have to worry about this anymore.
And okay, so does that feel good? let's talk about, so now we've got only a few minutes. So let's really, I mean, and I didn't even bring up 75 years of DC Comics. I mean, I have it sitting here. I have it right here. I got first printing. I was ready to show it on the $1 Million Comics Camp, but it almost doesn't fit on the dang thing. This thing is a giant.
It's a big book.
And then also, speaking of Abrams, you did the Will Eisner Champion of the Graphic Novel.
Yep.
2015, I believe it was. So let's close it out. Talk a little bit about these books and just about the newfound appreciation in the mainstream, old school book publishing world of comics, and how now we're seeing things like Joe Sacco's new work is coming out from, came out from Abrams, and
where people are publishing graphic novels across a much wider range of material. A lot of those things are finding audiences, not everything. Some things are finding phenomenal audiences. Some of the kids like Dav Pilkey's astronomical numbers. When things work, other people line up and say, oh, okay, let us try that. And in that sense, I think we're in a second golden age of comics because it's a wider range of creativity than we've ever had in the medium before.
I just wanted to flip through this book a little bit while you're talking. It's amazing.
A guy named Josh Baker, who was the designer on it, gets a lot of the credit for that.
I don't have the box anymore, though.
Well, you should have kept it.
I know.
It's not as valuable. Got to keep the toy boxes if you want to sell them. I don't keep my toy boxes.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that. Me neither. Good. That makes me happy to hear, actually.
It's a good time for comics. I'm, to the extent that any of the work that I did with my team helped make it possible, I'm really happy. I'm really proud of that. Would it have happened without us? Maybe. There were enough other people who were pushing on it in one fashion or another. I'm friendly with Art Spiegelman, and was friendly with Will Eisner when he was around, and they could stare each other down and say, I wasn't inspired by you, and of course you were inspired by me, and have that kind of argument. But I don't much believe in the great man theory of history. I believe in the forces of history. And by and large, the forces have gotten us to a good place in comics. If I played a little role in that, proud as hell to have done it. And, still write one every now and then. Hopefully someone will read one. And meanwhile, I'll teach and try and keep out of trouble.
You had one more. Oh, man, I had one more. You contributed. Oh, here it is. No, I got it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, more recent.
Yeah, that's
talk about this for a second if you can. Because, again, on my list, Colleen Duran, I just can't connect. I just want her to say no to me.
Yeah, I don't think Colleen's much on a podcast person, but
because she's amazing. Talk a little bit about this book if you can. This is your latest thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, I literally this afternoon just picked up the frame piece of Colleen's art that adorns my story for that.
She's incredible.
She's brilliantly talented and a lovely human being. So Barry Lyga was putting together this anthology of sort of YA-ish stories about kids with powers, kids in a superhero-ish mold, with a very diverse range of writers. And I've known Barry for years, since he was working at Diamond. We're good friends. And he called up and said, hey, do me a story. So I've never written prose fiction before, but effectively I had sold my first prose fiction before I'd actually written it. A rare treat. Everyone can be jealous.
Awesome.
And I wrote a short story for it, and I hope people like it. And Colleen did both cover art and a spot illustration for each of the different stories in the book.
I'm just going to say that ain't going to hurt, right? Because she is fantastic.
She's got a good commercial track record and certainly a fabulous aesthetic track record.
I love everything that she does. It's amazing. Okay, one final just sort of overall Paul Levitz question because I know you have to go.
You got about 30 seconds.
Okay. Well, I was just going to say, you took us you were part of that generation that took us from this era of Legion of Superheroes, and you took us to like a different era, dark and grimmer era in some ways of comics. There's been a lot of talk about overcorrection towards grim and gritty. I just want the final Paul Levitz word on that, how you feel.
I think the Legion stuff I wrote is optimistic, not pessimistic. I think it did more stuff blow up than in the old stories? Yes. Did some characters die? Well, that had been true in the stories since I was a 6-year-old kid. It's one of the advantages of writing the Legion. But going back to where we started, I think if you read my Legion material for my view of the future, it's that I think we're all going to figure out eventually how to get along, because if we don't, this planet's going to get blown up. And that's a hard thing to sell this week, particularly, because we're not getting along so well this week. But I think we'll figure out how. And I certainly hope we will. I have children and grandchildren as hostages to the future.
Yeah.
And, I want them to have a magnificent world. And I have every hope that they will.
I hope so too, Paul. And that's a great optimistic note to go out on. I hope you consider coming back maybe sometime if you've got something to promote.
Yeah.
Want to talk about?
I don't do a lot of energetic promotion these days because just not at that stage in my career. But, every now and again.
Hey, if you ever want to low-key soft sell something, I've got a spot for you, Paul.
Well, send your viewers out to see Dog this weekend, which my youngest son is the co-producer on. It's a good movie. And if they want to buy Generation Wonder when it comes out in another, I think 2 months, something like that, comes out around May or June, pick it up and let me know if you enjoy it. It's not hard to find me.
Okay, great. Thanks for talking with us today.
Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right, guys. That was the great Paul Levitz. That was really fun. I got a little bent out of shape there from the comic strip comment, but it's all good. I'm just no big deal because I know when he was here, when the comic strip dude, Chris Pierce, was here, he got swarmed in the comics. And I asked questions that didn't make him feel warm and fuzzy. And I get not everybody likes that. My interview style is what it is. I'm sorry. I speak from the heart and I ask what I'm curious about. So I want to thank everybody here who tuned in today. I want to thank you for liking, subscribing, blah, blah, blahing. If you've got comics you want to see on this show, send them into the $1 Million Mailbox, P.O. Box 1163, Arcata, California, 95518. I got closing credits we're going to play right now. And then what? Oh, don't forget, we'll have some kind of comic book cameo, just like any good comic book media. We've got a post-credits cameo to make you sit through the boring stuff. But it's not that long. Coming up in March, I've got, oh my gosh, it's going to be awesome. I've got Mike Richardson coming in. That is going to be fantastic. On Friday, I've got Serious Star Trek. Tune in for Serious Star Trek. We're going to be talking about Star Trek Picard. I don't watch it because I'm not watching any mainstream media in the month of March. This is my March of independence. So I'm not watching any mainstream movies or TV shows. I'm trying to stay away from corporate-owned media in general for 1 month. I figure it can't hurt me. Might even help me. Speaking of helping me, what would really help me is if you would consider clicking like or subscribe and click that bell for notifications. Stick around. I'm going to play the credits, and we will see you. When are we going to see you? Oh, yeah, I remember now. It's next time.